They were all hip to go, and they volunteered and they joined earlier. But I decided to stay and start college, which is what I wanted to do. And whatever happened with going to the draft would happen, and I knew I would go. I had no option with it. I didn't really think I would survive the war, but I would just take whatever I had to do, I would do. So I waited, and soon enough, I got the call to be drafted.
And you were living in New York at the time?
I was living on Staten Island, New York. I lived there and was born there. And my wife also was born on Staten Island. And so at any rate, I started college, and I finally got this order to report for the draft. And so I went down to a local theater in a shopping district on Staten Island at 7:30 one morning. The dates are in the report. I don't remember them offhand. And I was there, and I was picked up, and I shuttled off to Camp Kilmer, New York, which was a temporary Army post in northern New Jersey. And there I was inducted. And first with a physical. Actually, the first was a physical, and I approved it. And then I was told to appear within, I guess it was maybe 2 weeks, back at Camp Kilmer to report for service. And when I went back and told my mother and father that I had been accepted, and I was proud, but they were kind of distraught. But that's the way it was. So I reported. I was then sent for 13 weeks basic training to to Macon, Georgia, Camp Wheeler, a temporary Army camp, started primarily to train new people, inductees. When that 13 weeks was over, excuse me, we were shipped back. We were allowed something like a 2-week furlough before shipping out. And at the time that 2 weeks was up, I reported back to Camp Wheeler. And then we went from Camp Wheeler to Staten Island, where there was a terminal, ship piers, to ship out. And there were two troop ships there at the time. One was going to Italy, and the other was going to Northern Ireland with the 8th Division, which was to be used as a follow-on division after the invasion of Europe. And it turned out that as I was walking down to the port there, in the port, towards the ships, and the two ships were side by side, and we were walking down, and most everybody was going on. They were filling the first ship up first, going to Italy. And when I got closer, I kept hearing two names. One was Johnson and Lewitt. And Lewitt was Lenny Lewitt, who was a Jewish lad from the Bronx. And me from Staten Island. And we were quite friendly, in our basic training. And didn't answer the question, because you quickly learn in the Army you never volunteer for anybody, and they're looking for volunteers, you kind of lay low. But it was so insistent that Lenny and Lewitt that we finally had to answer. So we answered, and they said, well, you're coming here. Well, it turned out that there were two ships, one going to Italy, the other going to Northern Ireland for the second wave of entering Normandy. And on the second ship was the 8th Division. They had been a regular Army division, had a long history going back to the Battle of Vicksburg, and I don't know, quite a ways. And there was a New York State National Guard was activated to become the cadre for the 13th Infantry Regiment within the 8th Division. And that New York unit, 1st Battalion, 13th Infantry, was headed by a fellow by the name of was in the National Guard, a man by the name of Captain Morgan, Morgan, yes. He was a very colorful character. There was a fight promoter in New York City then who was quite famous in the boxing and wrestling world by the name of Dan Morgan. And he was nicknamed in the press as Dumb Danny Morgan. And it was Dan Morgan's son who was our captain. And he had an all New York unit, but two of the people went over the hill at the last minute, and their policy was they never shipped a unit out without full complement of people. So he searched all the replacements that were available and found two names with New York City, and we were called out. And so we got on this ship, and we shipped over.
Do you remember the name of the ship?
No, I don't, but I do know that it was a German ship that had been captured by the French off the coast of South America earlier in the war. It had been brought back to New York and been outfitted as a troop ship as opposed to a cargo ship. They had bunks in it, but the German crew remained on the ship, and they were not Nazis, and so they knew the ship, and so they were running it. And this was the maiden voyage after it had been started. And we started out. And the official history says we went over across the Atlantic, you know, with no trouble outside of the usual North Atlantic storms, which can be fierce. But it turned out that there were some glitches in the repair work. And when we started out after 2 or 3 days, the engines quit. And they went out and we went over in convoys, but fortunately this ship and it would go at the speed of the slower ship, but our ship having been refitted and changed, we could go at a much higher speed, but the engines quit. And so we were out in the stormy North Atlantic, bobbing around, and I figured I was never going to get to Europe, and it was so severe, the rolling over these high waves, that at times the stairways that went up, gangways I guess they call them on a ship, going up would go up at about a 45-degree angle from the hold, you know, back and forth up, and it pitched so steeply that those ones would almost, the ones that at this end would almost go level, and then the other way they'd be, you know, almost straight down. And people were thrown out of the bunks, so you had to hold on to your bunks with it. And that was kind of an interesting thing that we didn't think we'd get to Europe. And then they did get the engines fixed, and we did catch up, but then the engines quit again, but then they were able to get them going in a very short order, and the rest of the trip was uneventful. I made out better than many of the people did because I was able to go up on ship more frequently on deck because I didn't smoke, and so they were not concerned about a light showing, you know, at nighttime. So that made it a little bit more pleasant than otherwise.
What time of the year was this crossing?
We left, it's in the record there, we left something like December 5th. It was mid-December, and we landed a couple of weeks later, so it was towards the end of December. The exact dates are in the recording.
And where did you land?
We landed in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And then we got off the ship. We went by truck, army truck, down to Enniskillen, which is in the southern part of Northern Ireland, only about 5 or 6 miles from the border with Southern Ireland, which was not part of the English Empire and a completely separate country, and they were very friendly with the Nazis, and so we were always warned. And we had to stand guard very carefully to be sure that there were no inversions. And in some parts of some of the areas, there's some German or Irish German supporters among the Irish in Southern Ireland came up and tried to sabotage some things that So we had to be on the alert there. And we were there for about 6 months, give or take a few days. The exact dates are in the record. And this was the other key thing that was that I had going for me, because I had 6 more months of training. And there's a lot of techniques in the Army, in the infantry, that if you know them and follow them, it will substantially extend your your lifespan. For instance, if you're running across a field, you never run together in bunches. It's much easier for an enemy shooting at 5 or 6 people in a bunch to get a hit than a single person. So never travel in bunches. And this was particularly a problem when there were fields that were marked by barbed wire. And at one place there's a fence. And the tendency is everybody sees a fence opening in a fence as opposed to climbing over or under a barbed wire, so they go there. Well, the enemy, seeing 6 or 8 people, will aim at the middle of that 6 or 8 people, and they're bound to get one of them. A single person over here, the odds are they're going to miss. So your lifespan has a tendency to increase. And we learned that. And not only did we learn it intellectually, but after 6 months of having a sergeant yelling, "Don't bunch up," we did it consistently. And the same way with running. You never run a pattern. You never run a straight line, and never run in a fixed pattern. Always jiggle-jaggle, one way or the other. And you can hear bullets going by, but you hear them going by as opposed to hitting you. And that was extremely valuable training. Plus the fact that we had a lot of walks. Wednesdays were primarily a hike. And they typically were 20 miles. The first few weeks we would go with different, no packs, and then we had to carry certain things so that by the end of the time we were going to 20 miles with a full pack. And that will build your stamina quickly. And we had that. And that 6 months, I think, was, plus the knowledge of these infantry techniques is what, made the difference. And at any rate, that was fun. Then it came time to go out to start going in, and we were there for the second wave, and that started on July 4th. And so we left.
Second wave into Normandy.
Yeah, into Normandy. So we left the end of June. It took probably a week traveling up through Ireland, and then several days to get over through the English Channel. And we got to Normandy, and we were there a beautiful day, nice, and the sea was calm. There was no sign of any effort. In fact, it was a very, very pretty day. It was like landing on a beach in Florida. White sand. And we went on, I had to rappel down the side of the ship to get in a landing craft, infantry, and went ashore. And while I was in the heavy weapons unit, we were also trained, and we had capability, and we passed all the requirements for carrying a carbine and an M1 rifle. And depending on the situation, we were at times just like a regular infantryman. At other times, we'd be using the heavy weapons.
And what would be considered heavy weapons?
A 30 caliber water-cooled machine gun. That's what it was for us. Now, there are many heavier weapons too, but for something that we could carry, as opposed to something that needed to be pulled along on wheels. And so at any rate, we went through and at the time we landed, all of the Allies owned just 1 square mile of Europe. And that was several miles long, quite a number of miles long, and a few thousand miles deep.
1,000 feet.
1,000 feet deep. And so we landed. There was no activity on the beach. And by that time, they had cleaned up all the debris and all the blood and wrecked landing and, all of that stuff. And we marched that several, 1,000 feet into the hedgerow country. And there we would dig through, jump over the hedgerows. We'd put the machine gun on top. Do you know what a hedgerow is? Okay. We'd put that on top of the hedgerow, the machine gun, and fire, and the infantry, and we'd give protective fire for the infantrymen crawling along the side. And the Germans did have artillery, and they had tanks, and they had other things. But then they developed, and in fact, there was some sergeant in the tank corps, maintenance sergeant, among the one of the tank divisions, developed the idea of getting over the hedgerows, because when they went over the hedgerows, the tank would go up, and the underside of a tank is about as thick as a tin can, and so they were very vulnerable. And what he did was to weld spears of like angle iron or channel iron on the front of the tank. And then the tank would go through and push those spears under the hedgerow, into the hedgerow, lift the old hedgerow up. The gun would be above the hedgerow, and the whole hedgerow would go through without exposing that bottom soft metal. And that saved a lot of tankers and got us through there quite quickly. And that continued on for a while, and the first battle in Europe there was the landing in Normandy up to the point of the capture of St. Lo. And in the material there are some maps showing St. Lo some 20 or 25 miles approximately inland, which was a fairly major city, but not nearly the size of a Paris or something, but a sort of a regional city. And we got to the edge of that and stopped. And the plan was they decided to come in and the Germans were dug in quite heavily there to defend it. So there was they were going to bomb it first. And there was a whole day where we could almost not see the sun. There was a steady stream of bombers. They went over all day long. And then overnight, the British bombers came in, and they did the same thing. And whatever Germans were not killed then, they would have been so rattled from that heavily bombarded that we would then went through, and we could get through there with no trouble. And by this time also, General Patton came with a couple of divisions of tanks. And he had the tanks ready to go. And what happened after that is we started to attack the next day in St. Lo, but there was no opposition. They weren't there. The tanks were there, and the tanks could then move about 20 miles a day, because that's the most they could travel per day based on the gasoline consumption. And they would go and just barrel down 20, 30 miles a day, 15 or 20 miles a day, and get to where they were. But a tanker is very, very sensitive at night, very fearful at night, because 2 little grenades could completely disable a tank. One placed on the track so it can't move, and the other place near the body, the turret, and the body of the tank, and it can't rotate. So the tanks would go, but they needed infantry protection. The tankers had to rest up for the next day's battle, and so we would be trucked up, and then we'd get positions, and we'd completely surround the tank, each of the tanks, and have our machine guns ready and rifles ready, and then stay up all night watching for making sure nobody came in. The next day they'd be all, repaired, whatever had to be done, and gas put in them, and they'd take off again. And that continued on, and the dates are reasonably close in the history here. And they would, and that went on from for quite a ways till we got into beyond St. Lo and in a ways to the town of Rennes, R-E-N-N-S, and you'll see that on the map. And at that point, the bulk of the army then, and that gets really into central France, and the bulk of the army turned north to head up toward Germany, but our division, the 8th Division, was directed to turn south. And the reason we turned south, went to south, is that there's a peninsula that goes out. I have maps in here too that you'll be able to look at and see. But there's a peninsula that goes out. I think it's well, it doesn't matter. A peninsula that goes out, and there's a major city called Brest, B-R-E-S-T. And Brest has a deep water port. And up till that time, we had to bring everything into France, into Europe, Central Europe, via the English Channel and the beaches at Normandy. And so the tankers didn't get enough gas to do what they really wanted to do, and we couldn't get all that much ammunition in coming in that way. We needed a deep water port, and Brest was it. So our division was assigned a task of clearing that out and capturing Brest, so that we then had a deep water port to support it. And there's quite a few stories about it, and we pushed up and we took Brest. And one of the interesting things there, we got mentioned in the Stars and Stripes at the time, because every time anything was done and reported in Stars and Stripes was General so-and-so did this, and he met General somebody else, and a Colonel somebody else. But when we got up to Brest, and it was I was not personally involved in it, it was other people, privates and that in the 8th Division. They got up, and the German general there was left by Hitler with the instructions to hold that peninsula, deny the Allies access to the port, and you'll be there until you die. And that supposedly was what their story was. Well, we got and captured it all and got up to Brest, and we're ruling everything, and all of a sudden somebody appeared from a cave almost, underground hole somewhere, and there was a German officer, and he wanted to came up, a junior grade officer, and wanted to speak, and spoke, and he was taken prisoner, but then he started talking. I want to talk to somebody, so he began talking. And it turned out the German general was down in that hole. And he said, we want to surrender. He said, well, tell him come on up, or I'll throw a grenade down or something. And so when the word was fed up the line until our general got that word, and of course he wanted to be there to capture the other general, so he came. And so then he came, and they finally said, and this German colonel or somebody came up and said to him, well, you say you're a general, let me see your credentials. And the answer was, he pointed to a soldier carrying an M1 rifle, and he said, they're my credentials, get up here right away. Or he dropped a bomb. So they came up. And we kind of like that, because for once the lowly infantry gets some recognition. Yeah. But at any rate, that ended, and we had access to a deep water port. And at that point, we didn't need there, so we were loaded on. We went by train up to get up into northern France and into Germany. And the train we went on was from European railroad cars called 40 and 8. And what that meant was that they were meant to carry 40 men or 8 horses. And they were just plain, ordinary, absolutely plain freight cars. There were no benches to sit on, nothing that could be done, no sanitary facilities or nothing. But we were in there, and so we traveled, rattled on the train, but every a couple of hours we had to stop and get off to take care of various bodily functions and get around and stretch our legs and so on. And every time we stopped, we'd be met with the local French people who were, very happy to see us. And there were old men and all the women, and they were, would throw us flowers and so on. And so we continued with that without any any difficulty. And then we wound up getting up into Rhineland, which is like a state within Germany, and that was another battle. And I wound up with 4 battle stars: Normandy, northern France, and then up into Germany's central Rhineland, which is in part of Germany. Then I spent Christmas where I was going through. In World War I, it was trench warfare, and on Christmas they ceased activities. And this tradition is that the American soldiers sang Silent Night, and the Germans listened, and they answered back with Stille Nacht. And but we attacked on Christmas. And we went through, and we captured a command post, and they didn't think we were going to get there that quickly, obviously, but because they had to leave in a great hurry, they were later captured as they were leaving. But in the meantime, they left the half-eaten sandwiches, and they had letters they had received from home, and that they had to just leave, and they had a few cookies or things that somebody must have sent them for Christmas, and I was feeling kind of, what a shame to spoil it. Yeah, but they spoiled ours too. But so at any rate, I survived that, and we went through, and then we got up into what they call Central Europe. And that got up into Luxembourg, and we were on. We at one point there, and we were getting into Germany, and the question was, and we reached the German border before they did in other parts of the front, and we were held there for about a week or a week and a half, some period of time, just holding the line. But they stretched it way out. And so the division had quite a number of miles. I have some records of it, in the report. And what we did was to occupy what the Germans called the Maginot Line. And that was a series of bunkers that were arranged, and they were built with concrete. The ceiling on them it looked like the concrete in a range of 20 feet thick to be completely impenetrable by bombs. And that was set up pointing towards France, so that France could not come in and invade Germany. But we were looking at it from the other end. So, but we occupied that, and we had to hold, I don't know, quite a number of miles while the rest of the line caught up with it. And also, the big problem was getting all the supplies in, because those tanks consumed a lot of gas. We needed a lot of ammunition, a lot of food, and even with the port coming in, it was still a problem to get everything supplied. And so part of it was waiting for the other parts of the line to catch up, but also a shortage of gas coming in to continue further. And so we kind of got halfway through that Maginot Line, And fortunately, though, we attacked other parts of it and were able to make an end run. So, and that kind of, so we didn't have to slug our way through the rest of it. But so that was kind of a quiet time. But we had to be alert, and we'd go on patrols. And that long distance in between time would be covered several times to ensure there's no training coming back and forth. And there was a time, I think it was around Thanksgiving, as I recall, that I was was out on a patrol with a couple of other men, and we were going to find out. Our mission was to go and penetrate the enemy lines and find out what we could about what they had available, what was there, what kind of work they had. And we got out, and we were coming back. And we had been able to get quite a bit of information, but then Germans decided to attack, and so they had passed us by but didn't see us. And fortunately, there was some woods close by, so we kind of slipped into the woods and stayed there. And that attack had been repelled. And then when that quieted down, then we went out and came back and got into our unit. And we always had a password when we went out on patrol. We would say the password is something. It would be something like who was the ace pitcher on the Yankees, or something of that type. And of course, a day or two later, I had no idea what the password was, so we kind of worried about this, but we talked, and it turned out there was somebody that I knew from our unit was, there standing the guard to, and we were able to communicate and got back with no trouble. And I know that when we showed up, the rest of the unit were amazed. We thought you were goners because it was a couple of days.
So how many were in the patrol?
There was I think three. And I know when we were in this little wooded section, we just got in there and dug everybody. Just by this time, the other thing I should mention is that from time to time, my job changed, and this is reported in my report. I'm not sure exactly when these changes took place, but I was appointed and transferred to the headquarters company of the battalion. And that was interesting because I would go along, and I was appointed to be a communications person, which meant that I would go from the company headquarters out to the various lieutenants, the platoon leaders and that. But I would also go with our captain when he went back to battalion headquarters, and I would listen to what's going on. And periodically you'll see in the report that the first battalion was very frequently attached to some other unit. And I think the reason for it is that our battalion commander was a Lieutenant Colonel Cassie. And you'll have to get the spelling out of my report. In fact, until I got this from Googling, I had no idea how to spell it. But and he was a real gentleman, but he was a graduate of VMI, which is the second best military school after West Point. And he also was a Southern gentleman, and a very fine individual. And he would, and he really knew his stuff. And he would, every time he would get his orders from battalion headquarters, then he'd come back and he would lay out a battle plan. Today, Company E is going to be in reserve. We're going to attach, and I think our battalion, our company, was periodically detached to other units as well, as you'll see in the report, because of the talent that was there at the beginning. But I would listen to these plans, And he would say, now if they attack, they're probably going to come this way. This is the most logical way they would attack. And if that happens, then we're going to do this. Now, the other way they could attack would be some other way. And for that, he'd have another counter plan. And that was all set up at air time. And so he had it set up. The company commanders had their orders. They knew what they had to do. And then it was their job then to go back and, pass that down. But that was quite an education for me. And it was interesting in that job because I had to run back and forth between company headquarters I'd go with the company commander to the battalion, but then from the company headquarters out to the various platoons. And we had three means of communication. One was a walkie-talkie, which we virtually never used because the Germans could listen to it. And the third was wires and telephone, and would use that until we started getting some artillery and the wires would quickly be blown up. And the last way was by messenger. And we were the messenger. I was a messenger. And so I remember going and watching, seeing a regular GI, a rifleman, hunkered down in a foxhole, and I'm running because I had to catch up and get to the lieutenant to give him whatever the orders were. So that was interesting, and because of that, I had quite a varied experience. Why that happened, I don't know, but it did, and I think I had more knowledge, than many people would have had. The other thing about getting into is that at some point there, when I was in Germany, there was a time when we were on this long period of sort of just sitting still. So I got a 3-day, I wasn't 3-day, maybe a 1-day pass or 1.5-day pass, and went into around Luxembourg, and we visited some of the low country, and really couldn't see too much, except that I remember they had Red Cross giving out coffee and donuts, and and it turns out that I knew I worked for a long time in western Massachusetts for the Norton Company, and I knew some of the people in that company, and one of the wives was, it turned out, that had been worked on one of those Red Cross trucks. And in comparing notes, we kind of figured, well, she gave me a cup of coffee and a donut at some point, which was kind of interesting. But then we got up into Northern Europe and what they call Central Europe, and that's where the most ridiculous and terrible problem we had. It was in the Ardennes region. And the Ardennes, it was a national forest in Germany. It was very, very thick. You could hardly, you got into the center of the forest, and it was so tightly packed and so overgrown that it was almost like pulling a shade down, walking around in darkness the whole time. And I have quite a long bit of material here on the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. But it was given to the 8th Division to capture the German forest. And it turned out that the Germans were there, and there was a real screw-up on the part of the American command among staff officers as to the battle never should have been fought. Here comes my wife.
I'll just pause it.
Yeah.
You were talking about
the Ardennes forest was some forests that were built in Germany, I don't know, some generations ago. And the purpose, I'm not really sure, but I presume it had something to do with trying to preserve some area that was not completely built up and whatever. But this forest was so very dense that you really couldn't see it. And it turned out that the Germans were in there, and it appeared as though we had to go in and get it. So that was assigned to the 8th Division to capture this forest. And it was a excuse me, sort of an epic battle. And I remember we would go through, and division after division tried it and went through, and they went, and finally it came to the 8th Division to do it. And by that time it must have been worn down, and we finally did get through it. But the forest was so thick you couldn't see anything when you got in there. The incoming artillery would hit a treetop and explode. So now you have shrapnel raining down as opposed to, which is more deadly. The other thing is the Germans had a weapon that we called a bouncing Betsy. And it was a mine that was put in under the ground. You couldn't see it. A few inches under. You would step on it, and it would set off a minor charge, and that would blow up. Another bomb would jump up about 5 feet, and then a bigger, more powerful bomb would go off, and anybody coming within 10 feet of it was annihilated. And the only way it could do that would be to defeat it, would be to kind of crawl along with we had a machete that could dig in and find it. But they were so small that you could probably going to miss it. And that was a terrible, terrible battle. And it turned out to be one of the battles that they look at in the Army, where there have been battles, and the Army has done this forever. They'll look at battles and examine battles, and this is one they examined, and it never should have been fought. It was foolish. And the reason it was fought was laid to errors on the part of staff officers, because there was an order that said that every company commander should send a requisition for replacements the day before the battle, estimating how many people are going to lose, and send them in. But then there was to be another counteraction to that, or a control on it, that anybody where the casualties were high, traditionally high, for a day or two, to re-examine the entire strategy and what is really necessary. And so they kept sending new replacements, so we kept fighting. And it just chewed up people like crazy. And then finally it came up, and in the meantime, the Germans loved it because, it meant nothing to them. It was territory that we really didn't need. If they really felt threatened, they could have blown up some dams upstream and flooded the area, and it just never should have been done. And you'll find in the material here a report about, I don't know, it's quite a number of pages, maybe 30 or a few more pages, of stuff on an analysis of the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, and in the Ardennes, and it just it was a terrible, terrible thing.
Is there any one particular memory that really sticks out from that battle?
No, just the being in complete darkness, and actually, and we really didn't go that far. I mean, it was just so bad that we lost so many people that we just kind of stopped going after a while. And fortunately, I was one of the ones that was able to stop it. But and that went on, and somehow or other, I think what they've, I think towards the end there, I think they got wise that this isn't right. But then we rejoined it and kind of went around that, and we did go over and did close in on Rhineland, you know, in Germany, Central Europe. I crossed and we entered the only big city we were through. There's a plain after the forest is shown in the map, and then over on the Rhine River was a major city, Cologne. And we were assigned to take Cologne, and we did. It was the only time we had gone into a major city. In the small towns in France, the people had left. And actually, the other thing in France, for some reason, Paris was spared. And I think probably the only decent thing Hitler did, and he apparently really liked France, you know, Paris. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. I was there on business after it. It really is. But it was untouched, you know, by the war. But Cologne was not. And it was the first time, and going through France in the small villages, all the residents would somehow disappear. There was only a few of them. But in Cologne, it was a big city, and there's no place they could go. And it was the only time we really saw, you know, civilians there. And the plan was that we would not do anything more to destroy Cologne that already had been done by the air. And so the tanks stayed outside. They would be called in only if there was a real bottleneck at some building. They would come in and just selectively, you know, hit one building. But we went through, and it actually was, you know, no real problem. And we'd go through and find a house, and went from in neighborhoods and from house to house, and the only people there were, you know, very old men and women and children. They gave us a French phrase, a German phrase that I have forgotten, about coming out and surrender with your hands up, or otherwise we'll throw a grenade in. And if nobody came out, we would have. But nobody didn't come out, so I didn't have to, fortunately. And but they had been under a severe bombing, and the whole city. And I have, in fact, I think I could show you a copy of it from the New York Sunday newspaper, New York newspaper. My father had saved for me, showing the city of Cologne. And there was nothing in it but an absolutely gorgeous medieval temple, you know, cathedral. And it was still standing. It was absolutely a miracle. When we came in and saw that standing, I just couldn't believe that. And I have a friend who was in the Air Force at the time, and he said that they did tell him with the bombing, you know, bomb where you got to bomb, but if at all possible, spare the cathedral. And they did. And it was so, in the midst, it was really awe-inspiring to see, in the midst of all of that destruction and everything, to see this beautiful cathedral. And that you know, existed. And I did go back, and and the other thing is there was no building left more than like the first story. Unreal. And the civilians, and so many of them, there's so many there was no place to go, as opposed to farming country and small villages, that they were, we would go through house by house, and we had this phrase, and they'd come out, and we had instructions. Again, they gave us some phrases to go to the train station. And they went to the train station, and it was one big place where they could be and controlled. And they were in very poor health, because they lived there. They had no sanitary facilities, nothing for so long. they were there, and I had when we lived in Massachusetts, we had a friend who it turned out had been in the medical corps in World War II, and we're talking with him after the war. He said that he had been at that train station at that time, and they had powders that they gave them or something to disinfect them and you know, take care of them. But it was a real disaster. And
and this would have been early 1945?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I will get a picture. I'll get a. I think I even have a picture, a copy of that newspaper downstairs. But the only thing standing, you know, was that one cathedral. And then I went back on a business trip over there, and I went to Europe several times, but the only place I could get to in Europe was that area there around it. And the reason for it is that the company I worked for in Massachusetts had very early had a lot of overseas plants, and I was sent over there to work and do a job in their plant. And so what I did then was I showed up for work every day, but I stayed just outside of Cologne. It was only about a 20-mile difference. And I toured over all of these areas. And I have a few slides. They're not that great, but you know, some slides of that. And but that was interesting. But
so after Cologne, where did you?
Well, then after Cologne, and that's right on the Rhine River. Yep. And then what we did was to hold the line until the other parts on the Rhine River at Cologne, while the other sections of the line caught up. And if you remember, a few miles south of Cologne, there was a city called Remagen, I think it was, and there was a bridge over it. And the Germans were supposed to destroy that bridge, but they didn't. They had set off a charge, but the charge wasn't placed right. So we were able to get quite a number of troops and I think some tanks over the bridge before it collapsed. And so we didn't have to make another water crossing. And that was done, you know, further south from where I was in Cologne. But then we wound up going over, and there was a pocket of Germans right around the river there that was kind of cut off. And we were to eliminate that pocket, and that was some very severe fighting in that.
Did you get wounded in any of these battles?
I have no idea why I didn't. And but I didn't. I really didn't have anything. I think I can think of things that, you know, could help in my favor with it, but still, just the luck of the draw. But at any rate, we got there, and we were all set to attack. And we were gathered for breakfast, which we usually did before dawn, you know, 100 yards back or so. And the mess sergeant came around, and he kept calling my name. Where was I? And I, again, you never volunteer, lay low. But again, he was so insistent that I finally had to do it. And he said, where are you going? What do you want? He said, I was told to bring you back. Why? You're going where you want to go. Where do I want to go? Don't just come. And so he brought me back. And what turned out was that I had my second and probably the most beneficial thing. If I never won anything else, I'm glad I won this one. Eisenhower had established a policy that anybody infantryman who had been in combat from the time of Normandy till then would get a 45-day temporary duty furlough 45 days to start after you reach the U.S. And there were 2 of us in our division that qualified. I won. So
you went back to the States.
So what happened? And when you go through on my report, it'll tell you when I got back in the States, the exact date. But and so it took probably 2 weeks to get back, maybe a little longer. Again, it's in the record. And the 45 days was start after we got back, and I couldn't believe this was happening, and I know I wrote both my wife, who was not my wife at the time, and my mother, and my wife took it the right way, with it. My mother was worried silly because there was just before the war started on Staten Island, they built a rehabilitation center, part of something for the New York City. And the Army took that, the federal government took that over, and all the returning wounded came and landed on Staten Island, were taking there for further treatment before then shipping out to wherever in the country they went. And so they would, on Staten Island, they would see a constant flow of wounded veterans coming. And when I said, I'm going to see you soon, she right away thought it'll be on a,
She thought you'd been wounded.
Yeah, right. And but at any rate, that's how I got back. And then by the time the 45 days was over, the war in Europe was over. And so I reported back when I was supposed to report back, and they said, well, the war in Europe is now over, but the 8th Division is preparing to ship off for the invasion of Japan. And when we get the routing, where they're going to go, we will arrange to get you back to them en route to Japan. Okay. So it's back to Camp Kilmer, about 20 miles away. And I was doing that. But then by the end of, before they then came back and to be, with a word to ship, we had dropped first the 1 atomic bomb and then the 2nd atomic bomb, and it was over. So I realized my military career was over.
What did you do afterward?
Went back to college.
Where'd you go?
Wagner, on Staten Island.
Yep. Then you had a business career after that?
Well, a variety of things. I really wanted to teach. I went and got a master's degree in mathematics. That's what I wanted to teach. But they wound up not, well, by the time I was teaching back then was not a very lucrative job. Very, very poor. In the meantime, we got married in '48. And we had little ones appearing, and teachers' salaries, what they were, I had to go to work for a living. So I worked for quite a number of years in Worcester, and then retired and had a series of miscellaneous jobs and made some rather bum investments along the way. And
okay, well, let me just look over my list here, see if there's anything else. Is there anything that you would like to add?
I can't think of anything.
Okay. The food was pretty much K rations and occasional hot
No,
chocolate?
we would have, we would tend to have reasonably good food, and I really don't remember much about it. We always carried what I think was called a D ration, which was like an enhanced chocolate bar. And we did have the C rations and other things, but most of the time we could wind up meeting and have a good meal just almost in the pre-dawn hours. We always had water. We always carried a canteen, And that would never seem to be a problem. Oh, I might add that as a private, one of the things you would wind up doing a lot of was KP. I really learned how to peel potatoes.
What was the highest rank you achieved?
Buck sergeant.
Buck sergeant. Okay, well,
Yeah.
I'd like to thank you for your service and thank you for your time today. I think this is
Well,
an excellent interview.
I hope.